Welcome to Behind the Veil. Now, here is your transformational coach, Tammy Hawks.
Okay, so Aimee, you grew up in the shadow of the Dixie Mafia with your mom at the center of one of the South's most infamous murder plots. What was it really like to go through that kind of chaos, especially as a little girl?
I think as a child, you're taught to adapt to situations. So as a kid, it was a struggle, but it was also learning. And I think that we grew up in that situation pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So we were using grown up coping mechanisms, I believe, as children. And I think that our history previous um, to the chaos is really how we made it out, is our first
Yes.
stepping stone.
Yeah. So give us a little glimpse of what it looked like, before that you said that it kind of, set the tone for how you manage this, because that's what we do as kids, right? So give us a little glimpse of, that early childhood for you.
So we basically were raised in a suburb of Chicago and had a two-parent home. My sister was stepfathered by my father, and so her father was not present. But we had live-in au pairs, nannies, and we had two working parents. So we were just living the suburban cookie cutter family lifestyle growing up. And when my parents divorced is when my mother fell into the crime lifestyle that she was raised in. So she went back to
Oh, so
what
she
she
was
knew.
raised in it.
She was. My grandmother is in Wikipedia for running brothels. And then her sister, who is tenure, her senior, they all ran with that pretty rough crowd.
Wow, I didn't
Yeah,
realize the backstory there. That makes so much sense. So this was
right.
completely normal for your mom to be sucked back into this sort of lifestyle.
Yes, I think she just went back to what she knew.
Yeah. Okay, so for those viewers who do not know the story, could you tell us a bit about tell us the whole story as detailed as you can get in a summary type form?
Okay. So my parents are divorcing and we leave Chicago. And I'm going to start there because that's pretty much where the trauma starts. You lose your dad, you lose your family, and then we're losing our culture. We're going from Chicago to Mississippi. And along the way of losing our culture, we lose our family dog in the middle of that move. So we lost, our father, our way of life and living, our au pairs, our nannies, our dog, and then we move into Mississippi, and we move into Kirksey Nix's house, and he is pegged as the head of the Dixie Mafia to everybody out there in the public. To me, he was introduced as not the daddy, stepdaddy, and we were moved into his home in Mississippi in Ocean Springs. Um, there we lived a pretty normal life for a few years. We just, hopped into going to school and overcoming the, divorced household, single mom, new school, and obviously a new culture, going from the north to the south. So we started there, and then my mother fell into the murder plot. The Sherrys were murdered in Biloxi, and that was later on to be pegged into Kirksey Nix. He was, said to be the one that hired the murderer and had plotted that out. Kirksey McCord Nix has also been known to be or was said to be the one that put the hit out on Buford Pusser. So the movie Walking Tall, there are two different versions of that movie that is based around some of Kirksey McCord Nix's previous past, previous to us coming into the picture. When we came into the picture, my mom and Kirksey and his friends apparently were running a Lonely Heart scam out of Angola State Penitentiary. My sister and I were familiar with Angola State Penitentiary because we were carried there by our mother to meet these, prisoners. So That was another thing in life I think that's, a little astonishing to people. But my sister and I in coping, those were all just kind of adventures as kids. So, we did cope and adapt to those things that we were surrounded by, things that most children weren't surrounded with. So, as we moved forward into that, the scam was going on, and my mother had fallen into trouble one time with the law, not over the scam, but over some visit into prison, and I believe she had some marijuana in a box or something. So she had gone to prison or to jail in our young age. I think the first time she went to jail, I was 10 years old. So there was trouble because of the scam and because of her affiliation with visiting the prison and things that, were leading up to the murder. And then when the murder happened, she was pegged as a co-conspirator with, I believe, 91 counts total against her. And they were all based on conspiracy and lying. And I'm not sure that my mother had much more to do with anything. And I've never really tried to debate her innocence or guilt because she is my mother, and I have to live a different role, in her life. So, I really was a child at that time. So I've never really tried to try the case, if you will, per se. I have always just tried to uh, overcome, adapt, and continue to empower other people who have to, go down that path.
Yeah. And how old were you? What were the years of your life where she was imprisoned for these allegations?
Court started at 7 years old, and then she was in prison when I was 10, and she came out. She was in for a year. She came out for about a year, went in again. But from the time I was 7, court started, and until I was 21, her time in jail and her time in court and in turmoil never really stopped. But I think she was sentenced 7 years, and spent a good part of that 7 years in prison off and on.
Wow, only 7 years.
Her longest stint was 4 years and 4 months.
What was she not responsible for the murder weapon? For
What they said that she had passed a weapon, and of course, as kids, we're not gonna know. You know what I mean? We're not gonna be privy to that type of thing in a home, or we weren't. The things that we were keyed into were, money, or if we saw, her 100 pair of shoes in the closet, or her outfits, or her, we were not. We were totally kids in that. So she was pegged to have supposedly passed a weapon, but I don't believe that was ever any evidence found of that. And
I
I
see.
never, as a child, saw that.
Yeah, so here you are, this kid just, taking in this entire scenario. I'm curious because you said a lot about your coping mechanisms, right?
Hmm.
But you can see a lot more from this perspective looking back, right? So when you
Oh, yeah.
look back at that little girl that you were, who went
Oh,
through
yeah.
all this stuff and you had no idea because I know you had told me previous that your experiences of going to prison was not a terrible thing.
Right.
So what were the truly difficult parts for you and your sister now from the perspective you have looking back?
So, not having your parent around is obviously a major, major, major factor. But as kids, we became resilient and a little bit grown for our age, and realized that some of the things that were in the media, and that's a big factor today about how the media spins a story, and some of the things in the media just aren't what we lived. And, the gun would be representative of that. I mean, we were kids, we didn't see that. We didn't, you know, my mom played some roles, but there were some roles she didn't play, and we
I
never saw
see.
her handle a weapon ever, like even just to protect us at times where you would have thought a parent would have said, okay, there are threats against our lives now, and this is how we're going to be protected. That never, it never even came
Right.
up in that scenario. So there are things that were spun in the media that were completely just not the truth. And so we learned at an early age that people spin things and they tell stories, and it's to sell things, and the fact that I've always as a kid tried to be my authentic self, even if it hurt people, even if I was being the jerk or the mean one, I was always authentic in that feeling or in being myself because of the way I grew up, you know, and the much of that of as much lies and spinning as I saw, you know, it was almost ridiculous. And so we saw that. I did see one thing that hurt was to see parents pull their children back and not want them to play with us. Because I was young, I was 10, 7, 8, 9, 10, and
Mhm.
the whispers of you're not allowed to play with her, you know, and no, we don't hang out with them, and they're dangerous or they're trash. Well, now, if I was a parent and I had a child at school with me, I wouldn't want my child involved with the dangers that followed my family. So they were absolutely right as parents. But as a child, I was mortified. I did not understand
Yeah.
that. So that broke me as being labeled something you're not as a child. It's very hard for
Mhm.
somebody to tell a kid they're bad, you know. And I wasn't. It was my family. And I didn't understand those dangers because nobody in that prison or in that mafia was ever going to touch my sister or I. You know, we they loved us. We went into the prison and they you know, they were protectors of us. And so those people that they called monsters, we were taught to love and adore and care for. So and that's a scary thing as a child, you know, as a grown up now looking back at what we were taught. You know, we were taught to give people a second chance, but we were taught to see through some things that people should not look through.
That could be
People
so confusing to a child.
it could be very confusing, especially in how to give or receive love. You know what I mean? And who you trust to give or receive love, you know. Very much so I feel nobody ever wanted to hurt my family in that scenario. We were told by the FBI that we were targets of, you know, of the mafia, that we were going to be killed, or you know, there were prices on our heads, my grandmother's, my sister's, and my mother's. We lived checking the car for bombs at 7 and 8 years old. We were taught to do that, you
Wow.
know, that we lived in a lifestyle that many didn't. But as an adult now, I'm empowered by some of those moments because one, I survived, and two, I also see the spun side of it. You know, the FBI wanted information out of my mother, so of course they were going to use any weapon against her and her children to try to dig information. You know, I mean, it is a tactic, but it was used on my family, you know, in a way that was pretty destructive as a child, you know. And so I don't think that there's enough attention on, you know, those weapons that are used against people sometimes. Those children like me are collateral damage of that. You
Mhm.
know, I'm sure that no FBI agent telling my mom some false story that, you know, she was going to be killed by the people she was working for, worked with, and grew up with, you know, that she was going to be killed by them. That was false information. That was just them using a tactic. And I feel that, you know, a lot of tactics are used that I see now in life coming from a mile away, whereas most people don't, you know. And I'm able to say that FBI agent, his child wasn't at home checking for bombs. They were building sandcastles at 7 in Biloxi, Mississippi on the beach. I was not, you know. So, you know, I think people like him and people in those situations need to think about the collateral damage that they cause in the families. And you know, so those fun things and those false things that aren't real, they bother me. You know,
Yeah.
I'm a very much a black or white person, and I don't sit in gray areas very well or very kindly, you know.
What do you think drove your mom to this lifestyle?
I think she was raised in it. I think her mother was in it. I think her sister was 10 years older than her, and she was raised mainly passed around her family. She was given to her grandmother to be raised for a little bit with her brothers. Um, I think her sister, who was older, got out of the house sooner. She was kind of passed to the sister, back to the mother. And I think that the mother, you know, my grandmother and my aunt were just involved with those people from a young age, and they put that element around my mother. And you know, she knew Kirksey Nix at 13 years old, and then you know, later in life gets back in touch with him and, falls into the grips of whatever, the lonely heart scam, which is what I believe she was fully engulfed in, the scam. I don't believe, part of me doesn't believe that Kirksey Nix put the hit out on the judge for $100,000. So I have a problem with that. And many people may have a problem with me for having a problem with that, but I don't stand in the shadow, of, is there another answer there? Were they
Mm.
wrong? And I'm not saying that as a way to defend somebody. I was taught to see, it just doesn't make sense to me, the amount of money and the distance it went, not in
Mm.
the time frame and the politics of Biloxi. And
So
it's so talked
you
about.
think there was some stuff underneath
I
that?
think there's a lot underneath there. I think there's a lot of political things because Kirksey and the Dixie Mafia was always led into, being part of the Clinton contraband. So
Mm.
if there's political ties there, there's political ties there. What are they? What is really underneath all of that? And I'm not afraid to say that maybe they were right, maybe they weren't. I've never tried to try the case, is
Mm.
what I've never tried to do, but I just see so much there that they didn't go after. They put a sheriff, they took him out of his cell after he was arrested and they put him on the stand, and they called him sheriff on the stand instead of inmate. Now you tell me that that is, I mean, there are
Huh.
just things there, and again, I don't want to retry a case, but it's, what I grew up through and what I saw and what we have prevalent today in the news and in the media and in
That's
the
exactly
spins
what
and the
came to,
cover ups.
yeah,
I,
that's
I,
exactly what came to my mind is like now that everything is coming out about all the
yes,
cover-ups and all the shadiness, all these, even we look at human trafficking and it's
right.
like, who's underneath all that? Like, what are the cover-ups? And that's kind of what you're alluding to. Like it could very well be a cover-up, this whole thing.
It could be. And if it is or if it isn't, I had to live a certain version of it where Kirksey Nix did this, my mother was involved, Mike Gillage, the mayor, Pete Hallett, all these people were involved. And, here sits the story. But the phenomenal thing to me is that this is all wrapped around a time where gambling was a real subject of whether it was or wasn't going to make it into Biloxi,
Mm.
and that this judge's wife was running for mayor against at a certain time where gambling was a big issue. And
Hmm.
now you have Mike Gillage, who is the strip club, who's running every backdoor gambling game in Biloxi you can run, and who's sitting at those tables. I'm sure Biloxi's finest were
Wow.
cracking the cards there too. So I don't have any, big story bursting information. I was a child,
No, I
but
totally get
living
you,
what
but
we
you
live
do.
today,
Yeah.
hearing what I heard as a child and speaking to Kirksey Nix as an adult, which I have, I do question, validities and stories. And here's a man who's stuffed away in prison for life. What more can you put on him? How much more could you hurt him? Oh, another judge.
Yeah.
What's that gonna do? You
Wow.
know, I just, people, I've sat silent my whole life and never really put out there, my opinions or my feelings. And I've always regarded other people's feelings ahead of mine. But as we sit in a today's world, it's hard for me to, come into my 40s and be the person that I am, and having come through all the obstacles and things that I have come through, it's hard to sit silent and not want to say, you know, these things that people go through, and the way that news is spun and the way that social media has, just burn flames into the society of, bully and lie and twist. And I very much grew up in that, and I it's It's
Yeah,
so damaging to
it
our world,
impacted you on a very, very personal level.
very personal level.
Yeah. Um, so that's so crazy because as you're sitting there talking, I'm thinking about all these new cases that are coming up of like, hey, we need to look at this.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of I brain farted on their names, but the brothers, the
Menendez.
Mendez brothers, there we go.
Hmm.
And watching that case, and, as a trauma specialist, I'm sitting there looking at it like, how are we letting these young boys who were so manipulated and controlled, sit in jail for that case? Like, this is just my perspective. But then
Yeah.
hearing your story, I'm like, we get to look at all these cases that don't quite add up and say, our system is corrupt. There's no way around that, right? And you are proof of how it was just absolutely manipulated against you. Obviously, there's all the sides to the story, but I can
Oh, yeah.
see what you're writing in the sand here. Um,
Yeah. The
and
other side of it is, I never was thrown into the system. This is the crazy part about it. There were kids everywhere underneath all these people. Okay. My sister and I being one of them. My sister got married at 16 to be emancipated. I was 10. I was given to my best friend's mother and just custody papers signed. And then when it didn't work out there, more custody papers were signed. But my divorced father, my father, I would be sent to him every summer and be told not to tell anything that's going on at home, or I would lose my mother and my sister, that I would never see them again and have to go live with him. And,
who
it
told
was
you
made,
that?
oh, my mother
Oh,
and,
your
and,
mother would.
and her mother, that side of the family. So I kept it from my dad until I was 14 of what was going
He
on.
knew nothing.
But no judge, no system ever reached out to see where the other side of, for my sister or myself. There wasn't a teacher. There wasn't a FBI agent. There wasn't all these people who were all over these things that gave two craps about, they didn't care about the children. And that is sad to me, that we have all of these systems in place and we're helping all of these people. But when kids fall to these types of situations, we were just kind of bled through the system. I never once had a free health care, or never once, was picked up by the state to be in foster care or find my father. It would just amazed me, at those things. So when I was 14 and he found out, my mother couldn't control me at the moment. And she decided from prison to ground me. And I just kind of giggled. I'm like, look who's really grounded. And that's how evil I was as a child. I was like, you enjoy your cage.
Here's the thing. I don't think that's evil at all.
But yes, no, it was not. But that was, again, that was that toughness I had back then. And I was like, you enjoy your cage. I'm out here in freedom world. Like, you
Yeah.
can't ground me. So that made her so mad. She told my dad. And then my dad blamed me as the person who didn't tell the truth. And I'm thinking to
To
myself,
him.
yeah. And now that I'm
Wow.
an adult, I'm like, you two hated each other so much. You didn't even know what it was like to have a family or a child, because you were too busy, So I grew up in a lot of different scenarios that pull trauma with people. But as an adult now, and with God and grace and faith, I have very much so forgiven a lot of those things and all those people and those scenarios and situations. So I've been carried through a lot of past traumas when it comes to divorce and, the scandal and the high profile case, and going to 12 different schools in 12 years, passed around from state to state, moving around, you know, all of those things.
Hmm.
Faith is what really grounded me. I found faith at 14 years old,
Hmm.
and that's what really grounded me. It was another thing that came from the silver spoon start, as we were put in church and an Episcopal school. So I carried that into the coping. And I really found a base in that. And I really carry that today with me in all of my coping. So th- I feel like without faith, a lot of people can't be grounded um, coming through the traumas that I've come through.
Mm.
And I think that one of the things that faith has really, really given me is a guide of how to let go of what I feel is like anger, because
Mhm.
I was always the one to stand up, even having an older sister. I think that was like the largest, the problem is I always stood up to my mother. I always stood up to my father. I always stood up to those people because nobody fought for us. So the school system didn't, the parents didn't, the DCF or what, whatever the acronym is for that now these days. Child services didn't fight. Nobody really fought.
Mhm.
So I always became that fighter, fighting, fight,
Yeah.
fight, fight. And if I hadn't found faith, that would still be at the forefront of what I would, of like fighting my way to the top or fighting my way through. Now, I really just want to be put where I'm supposed to be. And that is really freeing of a lot of the traumas and the trying. And when you're put into a home as an orphan, you take the Cinderella effect. You're trying to clean and trying to earn your way to be loved like the other kids.
Mhm.
Or so you take on this whole world of trying to fix everything, trying to fix your parents, or trying to fix your mother, trying to fix the house, trying to fix the bed, so everybody comes home and appreciates you or likes you. And I got so over that, and I found that in faith. I found the value. I found the way to lay down the weapons and just let things naturally come to me that belonged with me. And I think that's where I sit today, is just really in my faith, letting things come to me and be the way they're supposed to be in my life.
Yeah. And you mentioned forgiveness. I believe that forgiveness is one of our biggest superpowers as humans, the letting go of the negative past. But what do your relationships sit like with all these people now? Your parents specifically.
So I put both parents out.
Hmm.
Um, I did that because as I get older, I think the wounds kind of get deeper,
Hmm.
and their lack of accountability towards each
Still.
other
Mm.
and towards me now. Yeah, I can't live in that. I won't.
Oh, yeah.
Um, yeah,
So they're
and so
they're they're still kind of like, oh, just no big deal with what I did. Like it was all good.
yeah, I mentioned in an interview or in a conversation, and I said, when I was orphaned, and I often say that, okay, that's what I feel like I lived.
Right.
I don't need anybody else to validate it. That'll be the term I use. I was orphaned at 10 years old. I had to go live with people who weren't my family, where I didn't have my own bedroom, and it wasn't in any relation to me. It was because custody papers were signed, very much like an adoption. So I was either adopted multiple times or orphaned. And my mother said, "You were never orphaned or homeless." And I said, "Oh, because I can remember a whole lot of years. I didn't have my own room in my own house, my own family. Very much felt that way."
Hmm.
So it's those moments where I realize that she doesn't take accountability for the places that we went while she was gone.
And I've noticed too, like with my own clients, it's the parents don't need to understand it from the child's perspective. They just need to listen because that child's perspective of what happened is truth to them. It doesn't
Yes.
need to be the relative truth that everyone experienced because everyone has their own particular truth. But for her not to just listen and validate your experience as the child, that could be incredibly hurtful.
Oh yeah.
And I know for myself, as I started telling my story publicly, you open yourself up to that where everyone doesn't see your perspective as truth, like loved ones in the same family unit. So, you have to get it's incredibly strong of you, Aimee, to be like, well, this is my truth. I'm going to speak it. And if that's not your truth, then you go ahead and tell yours. But this is mine, because that little girl in you is still there, very much feeling all the pain that she experienced, very much feeling the abandonment. And so for her not to have empathy and compassion for that little girl that you were that experienced all that shit,
Oh
like,
yeah.
then that's going to ultimately create this big wedge because she, let's be honest, she made some pretty big mistakes there.
Oh yeah. And forgivable. I mean, I've truly forgiven the
Yeah.
things. I just the continuance of the behavior
But
is
forgiveness is not being okay with the behavior.
that's right.
It's simply just breaking them loose of what has been, but it's not continuing the relationship forward.
Oh, correct.
Truly loving you is setting those boundaries and saying, "Hey, like you don't have to see it my way, but you do have to respect these boundaries."
Oh
And
yeah.
so you being able to speak your truth is I can't tell you how much freedom lies in that, you know?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I want to empower other people
Yeah.
and bring some awareness to the things that I went through, things that we could do
Yeah.
better.
Which
And I
is
and which is, really is understand that kids need people to stand up for them in this world today. And so much hate and so much ugliness is based on how these parents are parenting,
yeah.
And my mom could have parented a lot better going through what she went through. But I will say this, and I will stick up for her. I was always loved. I was, even in the bad moments, the way that she knew how to love, I was loved. I was cared for. You know, I anytime she had anything to give, she would give to us. I
Mhm.
don't think that she was a selfish person. My mom gave me the tools with the church and empathy. She gave me strength, to stand up for myself. She taught us that. She gave me the tools that I survive on today.
Yeah.
So, that forgiveness comes very easily for me. The toleration is what I can't is what's really hard for me. I have about a zero tolerance for any kind of drama in my life anymore. If when people bring things in that are dramatic, I just really shut them out. I just don't have a time or a space for it, and even
Girl,
in
you and me both.
friends gossiping and doing things, I tend to always carry people beside me, even the ones that don't belong there, who haven't earned their way there. I always tend to carry people beside me, and I get real disappointed when I look over and they're not doing the same for me.
Yeah.
And so, that's probably my largest hang up as an adult. If you aren't matching me where I'm coming from, I'm no longer there anymore. And it's not that I
Good for
completely,
you.
I just can't. If you want me to pick up your kid from school, then you need to be willing to take my dog to the vet.
Yeah.
I'm just that kind of person in life now. And so with my parents and with my father married a woman who was raised in Europe, and she's the rudest person I've ever met in life. She can't stand myself, and she doesn't like my father's brothers. I don't think she likes anybody but my father. I haven't met a person yet on earth that she likes other than my father. Maybe her sister, maybe. But I'm not going to tolerate that either. Just as evil as a woman as she is, I told my father, it's amazing how he hates my mother so much, but married a woman who's so much like her that they're in stark comparison to each other, in ways that they love their things more than they love their people.
Mhm.
They love their status and their situation more than they actually love people, and so they'll work on that before they'll work on the interiors of themselves or their homes or or their families. Those
Mm.
aren't important to them, And so the relationships are strained there. I didn't have an uncle or an aunt on my mother's side that ever came to my sister and I to say, "Hey, you know, let's help you where you're at." You know what
Mm.
I mean? Or we didn't get Christmas cards or birthday cards from anybody on my mother's side of the family. Um, we later found out my sister's father, who was a horrible guy really wasn't her father, and that came out in ancestry DNA, something my mother kind of, you know, didn't allude to, that there could be a possibility of anybody else
Oh,
ever. But we found that out
did you
later in
find her
life.
father?
We did, and he was passed, but we
Oh,
did find his family, so she was able to connect with some of them, which was really, really good.
oh, that's
Um,
awesome.
yeah, she actually came from a pretty decent family. Come to find out, not the horrific guy she was told about. So, decisions like that again, why was the man who was horrible leaned so hard into being the father when there was options there, or even a
Wow.
possibility? Why did we lean so hard one way and not go another? And just a lot of questions in continued um, hurts, or continued um, continued ways to just not be truthful or not be accountable.
Interesting.
So those are also things that just led to the demise of
Yeah,
let's
rightfully
be done
so.
here.
So, and your mom has been out how many years of prison?
I believe since I was 21.
21. And I
Mhm.
bet was there repair initially in the relationship? How has it unfolded since she's been out?
There was repairs. She got married and was married to a man for a really long time. He was older and had already raised his kids, and I was 16. And she married him, and he didn't want me in the home because he had already raised his children. So she put me in an apartment next to the freeway where I lived by myself.
At
I had the
16.
choice. Yes, I had the choice to live with roommates or live by myself, because she was going to be married to a man who had already raised his children. So um, she was like re-indicted in that time frame where they were married, and they stayed married. So after she was out, she went back to him, and he was an alcoholic. And I tried to repair a relationship. We had a semi relationship at that time, but he was an alcoholic and very rude. And I would have been miserable in the home anyway. She spared me from that. I mean,
But to be
honestly,
on your own in an apartment at 16?
yeah, yeah. It just, decisions like that, as I get older, I look back on, and I'm just like, wow, just wow.
Yeah,
But
because you have
what did she
children.
know better, though?
Yeah,
What
yeah,
the forgiveness comes from looking back at where she came from, and
yes.
what does she know better,
Yeah, because
and
generational trauma, obviously didn't go healing her generational trauma, because if she did, that would have been very different. But of course, we all hold generational trauma in our body until we heal it. And it
yeah,
seems like, you and your sister have really stepped up to be that in your family lineage, because those generational curses, they're very deep. So, and I believe that we all are doing the best we can with what we are given. So your mom just didn't know any better.
right, yeah,
But at the same time, like you said, owning your shit, being responsible and saying,
yeah,
hey, even if you did the best you can, it's still like, I'm sorry that what I did hurt you bad. I see that now.
right,
And that compassion piece that it obviously isn't there. I think, for me as a mom, I have that if my kid comes to me with anything, even if I didn't believe that it would be a hurtful thing, I'm like, I have so much compassion for what they're feeling, right?
yeah.
Not my perspective, but what they're feeling and their perspective, because it's valid, And if you don't have that, even grown up looking at your kids, and what ages are your kids?
I don't have any.
Oh, you don't have
I
any? I thought
I,
you
I
had
chose
kids.
none. Yes,
Okay.
I was a very hard. I'm not going to have any children, because my life was so hard raising
Yeah.
myself, that I decided that once I grew up, I didn't want to raise anybody else. I really
I
just wanted to.
totally,
I wanted to live life, because I felt like such an adult. At times, I felt 90. I mean, I think at 19, I felt 90 at times, just in all of the decision making and life choice, path taking, and all. I just was like, I don't want to do this for anybody else.
I totally get that.
Yeah, and I
And
love
I think
dogs.
it's
I'm the crazy dog
wonderful.
lady. Yeah,
Yeah.
crazy dog lady.
Oh, is that right?
But I chose, yeah, I'm in a marriage for 17 years now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I do have some successful relationships in my life,
Uh-huh.
and my sister and I are very, very close. And you know, we remain close. We raised each other. You know,
Yeah, trauma bonding.
we have a very big trauma bond. I value the friendships that I have when I walk into a room and I see somebody I haven't seen in 30 years and we get to talking, and I mean it's just magical because they're still that same person and I'm still that same person deep down.
Mm.
And then we get to talk about, you know, where we are today, and I think that I astonished some people that I made it out of, you know, where I was. And then there
Yeah.
are some people who just always believed it because I was just that tough, you know.
Yeah.
So there's both sides of that, you know, people who look at Heather and I and they say, hey, I don't know how you girls made it out, but we did. And I'm pretty proud of where we are and who we are as people. And you know, I'm proud of my mom and the relationships she's building now with other people. And I'm proud of my father for remaining in his marriage with, you know, someone I couldn't do it with for I don't know how long, you know, and you know, and for staying strong, you know, because you're supposed to put your spouse first, and I respect my father for that. I just can't watch it and sit beside him and love him dearly, you know. But it is what it is, and people who have removed themselves from my life have really blessed me by doing that too. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Everyone's here to show us something. We're
something.
we're we're all, we all go back to the same stuff. We're all part of the same stuff, and we're all here to learn and grow, I believe. So, with that being said, could you give the viewers something to, some sort of parting message on what you would what all this has meant to you and what you wish for them, that for them to gleam off your story?
I just really want for people to empower other people. I want people to take on being healers of other people and being healers of themselves, and not being afraid to step out into your healing, not be afraid to help, you know, the other person that's hurting. You know, sometimes we walk by a perfect stranger and just one smile can change their day. And
Hmm.
if I could lead with anything, is that kindness is free. It would have
Hmm.
been free to be, you know, kind to me back in the day. It's free to be kind today. It's going to be free to be kind tomorrow.
Hmm.
So I just wish people would use more of their free time to be kind and to go
Hmm.
out in the world and, you know, spread kindness, care about other people's feelings. Like you said, even if they aren't your own, you know, we've gotten way too politically against each other. You know,
Hmm.
we've gotten into this, you know, we can't have a difference of opinion and still get along. And I think that is wrong. You know, I have a difference of opinion of how things happened in my childhood as what the newspaper printed.
Hmm.
And, you know, that's okay. It's okay for there to be two different sides. Just really stand firm in your side, but be empathetic to the other side as well,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
love
and
that.
walk in kindness and in love.
Yeah, because you never know what someone else is going through.
You don't. You don't.
I
You
mean,
don't.
I have, with the work that I do, I have this ability to really see someone's pain. I see it in someone I see it, right? It's just so evident to me. But I think that people are so wrapped up in their own pain that they don't look to see what the people around them are going through and experiencing. So I think that's a great send away message. Thank you so much for
You're
coming
so
on and
welcome.
sharing your story. I loved it. I had a million more questions, but we only have time for what we have time for. So
That's right.
thank you for coming on and sharing your wisdom with
Well,
us.
thank you for having me on, and you call me anytime.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye.